What's up, beautiful people? I'm Gabby, and you're listening to the Growing Black Girl Podcast, an empowering podcast for those looking to learn from the shit we grow through. Join me weekly as we dig deeper into self-love, mental health and wellness, entrepreneurship, and so much more. So, whether you're a growing black girl, a grown black girl, or not a girl at all, this is a space for you. Let's start the show. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. Before we, address the elephant in the room, which is the title of this podcast, I am sitting down with a delicious cup of coffee. I hope you guys have your coffee or tea with you as well. I want to try a little bit of a thing where I tell you what kind of coffee I'm drinking and see what you guys think. I'm drinking a coffee called Day Drinker from Neighborhood. And it has a house-made bourbon reduction vanilla with my choice of milk and a beechwood espresso. It is delicious. I got it with oat milk. It slaps. It's everything I needed this morning. And now I really feel like I'm ready to dive into this episode. So, the title of this episode, which I feel like I'm having a little bit of secondhand embarrassment about, but also we're here now. It is what it is. The title of this episode is Imposter Syndrome is for White Women. And I know what you're thinking. My friend, this is your first episode and this is how you're acting? You're coming out the gate like this? You're on one. And to that I would say, you're not wrong. I am going to really talk about where this idea came from, really walk you through the journey, walk you through my thought processes, and maybe some things will hit for you. Maybe some things you'll think, oh, she is talking out the side of her neck. And both of those reactions are perfectly okay. The way this episode is going to be broken into is the first half is going to be me sharing where this idea came from, sharing the conversations that I've had with people in my circle that kind of support what I'm thinking and that kind of say, you're absolutely bugging. So I'm going to present you with both sides of that conversation as well. And then the second half of this exact same episode is really going to be me looking into what the information out there says. If you are listening to this podcast and you are a person of color or from another marginalized community and you're saying, hey, my beautiful little growing black girl, I've experienced imposter syndrome and nothing that you're saying is making any sense. That's okay. The second half of this episode is totally going to be for you. I wanted to do something different where I'm not just here telling you my experiences and my thoughts. I think a lot of times the way podcasts are set up is the host or whoever the guest is, we are relying on them to be the experts. And I think we are experts of our own experiences. And the only thing that we can do is listen to someone else's experience and trust them as valid and true. And again, the experts of their own experience. So I'm just going to share with you, if anything that I say resonates, perfect. If none of it resonates, that's okay too. This is supposed to be a conversation starter. We are growing and learning live and in color or pre-recorded and on audio. So let me tell you where this whole idea that imposter syndrome is for white women even came from. Let's just get into it. So when I recorded the intro, sort of the intro, that like preliminary podcast that's already out, when I recorded that, the last thing that I said was, and our first episode is going to be on imposter syndrome. And I was just talking because, again, if you've listened to that episode, you know that's what I like to do. So I hadn't really planned out what the first episode was going to be. Imposter syndrome was sort of on my mind. I had listened to another podcast on it, which was by a white woman, and sort of just had it playing in the background while I was working. And so that was sort of front of mind when I said, I'm going to do an episode on imposter syndrome. Obviously, the way people of color and other marginalized communities move through the world is going to be different than the dominant culture moves through the world. And so me listening to a podcast on imposter syndrome done by a 20-something-year-old white woman might not hit for a queer black man. I'm not a queer black man, so this probably won't hit for that either, but that's the best example I could come up with off the dome. So thinking about that just kind of popped into my mind, and I said, girl, you didn't record a podcast. Looks like it's going to be on imposter syndrome. Later that night, I was thinking, little growing black girl, have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? And I could not recall a time that I have. And maybe it's a little bit because I think I'm the hottest thing since sliced bread. Like maybe I'm too confident and maybe I need to be humbled in this world. It's super possible. But I couldn't think of a time that I have personally experienced imposter syndrome. And then I started thinking about the women of color in my life and have they ever expressed to me that they've experienced imposter syndrome. And I hadn't heard about that from them either. So then that kind of led me down the rabbit hole. I'm obviously a little bit biased, and I just believe that black women can do anything. And when put in the position and sort of given the opportunity to rise to the occasion, there is a little less, again, in my mind, of black women thinking, I don't belong here, and more of, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to make something move and shake, and I'm going to get it done. Because I feel like, obviously, black women are not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. But I think that that's more so the idea or the culture or the stereotype or standard put on black women is like, when put in a situation, we have no option. There's no other choice but to survive. And so the thought of, oh my gosh, I don't belong here. I don't fit in. What am I going to do? How did I even get here? There's not a lot of time for that because we sort of default into survival mode. That's sort of where my thinking was. Let me take it a step further. Obviously, let me backtrack. Obviously is the wrong word because this is a safe space. To me, white men don't experience imposter syndrome because the world is designed for them. Everything that, for the dominant culture, everything is sort of tailored, created, designed for them. And so there is an innate sense of privilege that is, could be caught, could be taught. For those of you that don't know what that means, there are behaviors that are not explicitly said to you or ideas that are not explicitly shared, but that other people's behaviors you sort of pick up on. So those are caught. And then there are very real conversations that your parents or your friends or your aunts, uncles, whoever your inner circle was when you were growing up might have very explicitly said the world is made for white men, and those are taught. So I don't want to just throw white men everywhere under the bus and say that they're just all out here living in privilege. Though true, I want to also acknowledge that some of that is caught, some of that is taught. So, for example, if you have not seen the innate ownership and privilege of Western society, Western culture done by white men, this is a great example. A couple weeks ago, I was driving home and I live in a gated community with the little, we got a couple gates, but the entrance that I was going into had one of the little arm gate lifty things, not a open slide gate. And this white man was running, had his headphones in, and he was running in the middle of the street, not on the sidewalk, which is fine, not going towards oncoming traffic, which I feel like is runners one-on-one. If you're a runner, you're probably yelling right now like, she's not a runner, she don't know what she's talking about, and that's fine. I always thought you ran towards oncoming traffic so that way you could see the cars and the cars could see you, but what do I know? So this nice man is running in the middle of the street and I'm trying to get into the neighborhood. He has in his headphones so he doesn't know that I'm behind him, and I'm driving slowly. I have a little tag key fob thing that lets the security at the gate know I live in this neighborhood. Please let me in. And instead of thinking I should get out of the street, the man just keeps running on the street and the security guard opens the gate. Now for me, in this brown body that I have lived in my whole life, I would have thought, oh, there must be a car behind me, because why else would security lift the arm of the gate for a runner when I can run around said gate? Arm lift thingy. That would have been my first thought. Like, oh, let me get out the way. Somebody's obviously behind me. The thought did not even cross my brethren's mind. He waved. He was like, thank you so much for opening the arm gate thingy, so now I don't have to take 2 steps to the left to go around it. I don't know. But that's the kind of stuff that I mean. Is it bad? No. Did it delay me from getting home a little bit longer? Sure. Am I still here? Obviously, I'm talking to you on this podcast. So the world didn't end, but that is an example of how the world is sort of designed, and that messages are caught and taught. The message that I was caught and or taught was nobody is like doing that kind of thing for me just because. There is probably another reason, and I should check to see if there's a car behind me. And this person thought, wow, that security guard is so kind that they are going out of their way to open the gate for me so I don't have to go out of my way. For example, okay, so already scratching white men off of the list of those who are experiencing imposter syndrome. And this is, I'm keeping it really on a superficial and race level right now. I want to give the caveat that if you are a very young white man listening to the Growing Black Girl podcast, welcome. And also, if you're a young man and you're going into a workspace where it's a bunch of older white men, you might feel imposter syndrome in that scenario because there is a historically included, historically excluded group. If you are the minority in that workplace, sure, you can also experience imposter syndrome as well. So moving on from that, we're kicking white men out of the conversation for right now because I'm like, I don't really know if white men are experiencing that. And then I thought, well, what about black men? Are black men experiencing imposter syndrome? And I decided to not answer that question myself because I'm not a black man. So moving right along from that demographic, and then it sort of just left me with white women. The evidence that I have to support that imposter syndrome is for white women is, well, the information that is out there is from white women. It's white women talking about their experiences in imposter syndrome, thinking about how often are black women promoted to places where their talent, their abilities have to be stretched, like opportunities for growth. How often are they being chosen over white women or white men? So again, all of the variables per se that I was looking into really just left me with white women. And when I took this idea to one of my mentors, who happens to be a white woman, I said, what do you think? Am I tripping? Is there an experience that you've had that I am completely overlooking? Do you also suffer from very high self-esteem as I do? And you also have never experienced imposter syndrome? And the conversation that we had was really helpful. She let me know that the times that she experienced imposter syndrome were when she was in grad school. Let me please pause. Somebody's car alarm is going off, and if you can hear it, I am so very sorry. I'm just a person trying to record a podcast, and I cannot control the outside noise, okay? I'm new here too. She's growing, and she's a black girl. Bear with me. So she was saying that the times that she's experienced imposter syndrome is when she was in grad school getting her doctorate, and was thinking, how in the world did I get here? Am I supposed to be here? Just kind of felt like she didn't know what she was supposed to be doing or how she got into the room. And that was the first thing that sort of came to mind. And we sort of talked about, being a white woman, you have the disadvantage of being a woman, but you have the privilege of being white. And so in a world of patriarchy, in a world where patriarchy is dominant and whiteness and maleness and cisgender and heterosexual and all of those dominant culture identities, in a world where that is prevalent and that is where innate privilege is, there is a sort of privilege to proximity of that dominant culture. But then there's also that disadvantage of being a woman. And when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to those spaces where someone might experience imposter syndrome, that closeness, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Is that the expression? A double-edged sword where you're still a woman, so you still sort of are stuck under the thumb of the patriarchy with the rest of us. And you're a white woman. You're white. So you're already seen as a little bit higher, but not that much higher. And so we talked about that being a double-edged sword and how that's probably really difficult to navigate and sort of brings forth some sort of imposter syndrome. We talked about how there is a level of managed expectations for white women. And when they're put in that position, there is potentially the first time that level of pressure or that level of expectation has been put on a white woman, and that is why imposter syndrome comes up. And talking with her, I started to think more about, in the same way that I don't know if I believe that people of color can be racist. I know some of y'all are up in arms. I can unpack that another day, but we're not going to get into it. Just trust me. In the same way that I don't know if I believe that people of color can be racist, I don't know if me feeling imposter syndrome as a person of color in a world that is not designed or catered to me can quote unquote feel imposter syndrome. If I'm feeling a sense of not belonging or like I shouldn't be somewhere or like a imposter, then it is not a syndrome. It is not something that I've sort of named or created or facilitated in my own mind. It is how the world is actually set up. So the word imposter doesn't make sense because imposter has a sense of falseness to it. And if the world is already not set up for me, if the workplace that I am in is not diverse, does not have equitable hiring practices, does not have a culture of retention and belonging, then me feeling like an imposter, it can't happen because the place is not designed for me anyways. Does that make sense? I'm hearing a lot of yeses and a couple no's, so I'm going to keep going. The other person that I talked to is a Black male friend of mine, and he expressed experiencing imposter syndrome in the tech space. And having that conversation with him, he and I have some of the best conversations because we are either saying the exact same thing, just in very different words. So we spend 45 minutes trying to understand that we're saying the same thing and we have different communication styles, or we just 1000% disagree. So it's fantastic. I'm happy that I talked to him about this topic beforehand. He expressed that he has experienced imposter syndrome and that getting promoted in his job in the tech space and being surrounded by older white men, none of them made him feel like he didn't belong, but he sort of felt weird about asking for help or reaching out. And wasn't sure where that feeling was coming from because no one directly made him feel that way. Again, I think I can kind of see that. And in my mind, if you have been taught or you have caught the messaging that those spaces aren't for you and those spaces are not designed for you, or that this world as a whole is not designed for you, then going into a space where people don't look like you, people are not in your same age group, you are newer to the team, so you don't have the same amount of tenure, etc., then that's already not a diverse space. And so there is already not a sense of belonging. And if the place is not designed to have a diverse workforce and to have people that sort of have that sense of belonging, that have equitable practices, then is it imposter? Are you an imposter? And is it a syndrome? So that is where all of that is coming from. My thought process is, I don't think marginalized communities, and specifically people of color, can actually experience imposter syndrome because there are not a lot of spaces where we are innately welcomed, or that the system or the structure is innately welcoming of marginalized communities. There's not a lot of those spaces. And if you are thinking, well, I've definitely experienced imposter syndrome, consider what space you are in. Were you in a super diverse space? Were you in a space of all people of color or people that fit your identities? Or were you in spaces where the majority of people were a part of the dominant culture? See what sort of sits and rings true for you. And then we sort of kicked out white men because white men have an innate sense of ownership of the world because that is how it was designed. Whether they are actively seeking those privileges or actively taking advantage of those privileges, or if they just happen to live their life and are not active recipients of that privilege. And then white women, we are saying, kind of fit in the influx. Influx feels like the wrong word, but we're going to roll with the punches. Hello. Sort of fit in the, if y'all could see my hand, I'm doing like a wavelength. You know, they have the privilege of being white and the disadvantage of being a woman. And in workspaces and in spaces where white men are the dominant culture, which is, as I've said, basically everywhere, then they sort of want to stick with that privilege, stick with that patriarchy, because they get like secondhand privileges from being white and being okay, or sort of going with the flow of the patriarchy per se, not rocking the boat. They get access in higher senses of privilege. And when put in a position or given an opportunity to grow and stretch, that may be the first time that those very explicit expectations are being named, which can cause imposter syndrome, and or they are sort of struggling and fighting through, you know, being white and also being a woman. Hope that makes sense. I'm going to pause right here and then come back for part 2 after I, do a little bit more research and sort of speak to the people of color who might be listening, or other marginalized communities who might be listening, who are saying, everything that you said was cute. I see what you're trying to say. But I've definitely experienced very real imposter syndrome. It felt like imposter syndrome. I was in places where my identities were abundant in the space that I was in, and I still felt like I didn't belong there. I want to make sure that you guys have tips, resources, and hopefully, depending on what information is out there, culturally competent tips and resources for sort of navigating imposter syndrome should you come across it. So I will BRB. All right, I am back with the information we have all been waiting for. So it wasn't always called imposter syndrome. It was initially called imposter phenomenon. I like that a little bit better because syndrome sort of has a innate, like, blaming the victim type of vibe to it. And so phenomenon sort of, makes it less negative to me. Like, this is a thing that sometimes happens, and not a shaming or blaming the person experiencing it as you just have low self-esteem or low self-worth, which is never the vibe we're going for. So the term imposter phenomenon was coined in the late 1970s by 2 psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And what their research showed, or basically what they did, is people that were reporting imposter syndrome, they looked at their early childhood, their early life, and they typically found that people who came from families who prioritized or put a lot of value or self-worth into achievements, specifically effortless achievements, were those individuals who would later enter the workforce or later enter, quote unquote, the real world, and would realize very rarely are achievements effortless. So that is where the imposter phenomenon was coming from. Now, some people believe, and I believe that I am in this category, I don't think that takes into account the historical and cultural context, which I mentioned in the first half of this episode. We typically see imposter syndrome specifically. Maybe if we called it imposter phenomenon, we wouldn't. But we typically see imposter syndrome as like a lack of self-esteem and sort of the fault of the individual and not the byproduct of exclusionary environments. Some research says it boils down to personality type. So it's not about gender and it's not about race. It's about if you personally hold yourself to impossibly high standards, if you have a hard time seeing your accomplishments as such, if you explain away your accomplishments instead of like holding them to the weight and value and awesomeness that they are. I wanted to say accomplishment like 8 more times in that sentence. If you don't hold your successes to a high standard, or you are not celebrating your small wins, if that's not your vibe, if that's not your default, then you're more likely to experience imposter syndrome. And with all of that, I still wanted to sort of come back to some personal tips. I was seeing as I was researching that a lot of the tips come down to the personal. When you are looking at articles published by schools about how Black and brown students are the ones that experience higher rates of imposter syndrome, the tips are like, listen to podcasts, read books, create your own network, find your people, which is great. And I think all of those tips still really work. And because they don't take into consideration the cultural and societal, historical, whatever context, it sort of lets institutions and the systems off the hook. And those societal factors don't have to be addressed if you call it a syndrome and you blame the individual experiencing, etc., or the imposterness. So I'm going to give you some of the personal tips, and then we're going to talk just a tiny little smidge about fixing the societal aspect of things. So one of the personal tips was to write down your accomplishments and celebrate the small wins. There's also an option for mentorship in therapy. If you go to therapy, you might learn a little bit of something about thinking traps and how that might show up. If you are feeling like an imposter, you can learn about things like catastrophizing and mind reading, where you are only feeling like an imposter because you think everyone else is thinking that you're an imposter, or you are only feeling like an imposter because you did one thing wrong and now you think you're going to lose your job because you never should have had it in the first place. Those sort of thinking traps can be linked back to imposter syndrome as well. So mentorship or therapy is a great personal option if you are looking for ways to step in and what you can do on a personal level and interpersonal level. And then positive affirmations and creating intentional communities and support systems. Now, like I said previously, this doesn't dismiss the societal factors, and those still very much need to be addressed. So while you are looking at the personal and interpersonal ways that imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon are showing up, also be aware of the organizational and the cultural levels as well. It's not an individual issue to fix. It requires creating spaces where differences in achievements learning styles, leadership, etc. are all accepted and spaces held for those as well. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast, this episode. If something came up for you and really resonated with you, or you hated this entire thing, you hated the format, none of it made sense to you, none of it gelled with you, I don't know. If you have any sort of feedback, any sort of reviews, of course, you can leave a review on wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can head over to Instagram and give us a follow and comment as well. I want to hear from you guys. This is going to be a lot less fun if I'm just talking to myself and I don't have the opportunity to engage and learn from you all as well. So head over to Instagram, follow me at The Growing Black Girl Pod. Drop a comment, leave a comment, send me a message. I want to know what you guys think. And I will see you in our next episode.